Hello, welcome to this video on paper 1 question 2. Now for question 2 you really do need to know the story, and that's why it's really important that you've spent time reading through the extract and making sure that you understand what's going on in the story, and not just the plot but actually what's under the surface, or what we call the subtext. So the best way to put that is what's really going on. So whatever extract you're looking at, there'll be a story about a character that's going through some sort of change. However, there'll be something under the surface, some big ideas that are bubbling under. And so it's really important that you actually understand those things before you answer this question. And it's where a lot of students fall down, because what they do is they just look to try and spot things. And actually, you need to understand the story before you can talk about what the writer has done and why they've done it. So question 2. And this is what question 2 will look like. The examiner will give you an extract, and the extract they will give you will be an extract that's actually full of loads of interesting language features. Now the examiner does that on purpose so that you've got something you can talk about. The problem that often happens is students try to talk about every single technique, and the examiner doesn't need you to do that. They just want you to be selective and pick out. Now again, like question 1, this is limited to a small section of the text, and you can see here that this one is from line 6 to 14. So you should be talking about the techniques in line 6 to 14. So what's in that little box there? Not the whole story and other extracts in there, but what's actually in this bit here. So what does this question do? Well, the first thing is it checks your understanding, that you understand the subtext of the story. What's really going on in here? Do you really know what's going on with Rosabelle? Yes, she's on a bus, but do you understand what's really going on under the surface? It's to check to see that you can comment on the choices made by writers. So can you talk about words or techniques that writers have used? And it checks to see if you can explain why the writer has written things in the way they have. And it's also a way for the examiner to check to see that you understand how readers react to this bit. And so there's quite a lot that this question is asking you to go for. And you can see that it's 8 marks, and it says in the question itself, and you can see that how does the writer use language here to describe Rosabelle's bus journey home? You could include the writer's choice of words, phrases, language features, techniques, and sentence forms. Now, personally, we would avoid sentences, okay, because it doesn't produce really precise analysis. And the same with punctuation. It's words, phrases, and techniques, not punctuation. So do not write about punctuation here. So you can see on the question itself that it's got a focus. So how does the writer use language to describe Rosabelle's bus journey? And in that extract, you're looking to find 2 or 3 techniques. There'll be lots of techniques in there, but you only need to give 2 or 3. Now, the key thing to remember about this question is that it's about why. Why has the writer used that word? Why has the writer used that technique? That's what this question is about. It's not about spotting things. It's about a bit more than spotting. Now this is where our Squeals comes in, because if you can spot something in the extract, you can use a quote from the extract, and you can talk about the effect, whether it's a positive or negative thing, then you're on track for getting 3 marks out of 8. So that's what you need to do. And these are the basics. So you need to be able to spot something, to quote something, and talk about the effect of that thing. So those are what will get you 3 marks. What will get you more marks is by the rest of the things in Squeals. So explaining, why has the writer chosen to use that technique? Why does the writer want us to feel this particular feeling? Linking it to something else in the story. And then finally, symbolizing. Okay, so this shows us this. What could it be a symbol of? And all these things are what gets students 4 to 8 marks. And it's the quality of this explanation that gets you between 4 and 8 marks. So you can see that these are the basics. So if you can name a technique in there, you can quote it and say how you feel, then that gets you 3 marks. If you can explain why the writer has used that technique, if you can link it to something else that's happening in the story, and you can use it to talk about the symbolism, then you're on track for getting more than half marks. And as a guide, half marks is usually a grade 4. So the more marks you get, the closer you are to a grade 9. The extract will have loads of techniques. And so what you've got to really do is spend time not finding every single technique in that extract, but thinking about the most effective ones you can explain. So for example, pick 2 or 3 language devices from the extract. So the ones we're going to look at today are fairy palaces, oozing, and a row of people, one meaningless staring face. That's all you need from the extract. And so you can see that you don't need lots of techniques. You need to be really good at talking about little bits and exploring. And one of the things we say is write a lot about a little. You should be able to write a massive paragraph about each and every one of those phrases or techniques there. That's what this question is expecting you to do. Okay, we're going to do a little bit of planning. I'm going to show you how to kind of approach things. Now, often what students do is they spot every single technique and they don't do the thinking. And what we're going to do is we're just going to do a little bit of thinking with this technique here. And all you've got to do is spend that time, because it will help in your explanation when you write a paragraph about this. So if we look at this, we can talk about this in terms of technique. So what has the writer done? So the writer has used this image here. So it's an image, and we can be a little bit more precise. We can say that the writer has used a metaphor, because what we're talking about are shops and buildings, and they're not really fairy palaces. They're actually just shops that look really good and amazing. So if we look at that, we can kind of think, well, if we describe it as a positive thing, we can see that actually the reader would think this is quite a positive thing. You know, fairy palaces, because why? Fairies are seen as magical, aren't they? And so we've got this sense of magical idea. But also palaces, we tend to think of like kings, and we think of queens, we think of rich people, and we think of power, and we think of large impressive buildings. So what we can say now is this is kind of the effect. So the writer uses the metaphor fairy palaces to give a sense of how this place seems magical and how impressed people would be seeing these things outside. So that's one way of looking at it. But do we think the writer, why is the writer, and this is the question that we need to go back to, why? Why has the writer used this? Does Rosabelle, this character, does she see it like a fairy palace? Is she seeing it as something magical or impressive? Well, actually, if we think about the story, Rosabelle is quite sad and miserable. So actually, it describes it as a fairy palace, But actually for Rosabelle, it isn't a positive thing. It's a quite negative thing. And so this idea of it being a fairy palace, fairies are unrealistic. I'm sorry if I've injured a fairy in saying that they're not real, okay? But they're unrealistic. And so it's almost like it's not real for her. But also palaces are big and impressive, but also they're hard to get into. And so it's unattainable. So what we're seeing with our character Rosabelle is this idea of almost like jealousy, and this idea that things look so good and positive and magical, but actually it's so far from her life. Fairies, unreal. Palaces, you can't get in them. So you can see by just doing a little bit of thinking, we can start coming up with ideas about why the writer has chosen this. So why has the writer used the metaphor fairy palaces? Well, in my opinion, the reason why the writers used fairy palaces is to show the gap and the difference between her life and where she wants to be. And the fairy palaces represents what she wants. She wants that magical experience, but actually her life is miserable. And so what the writer is doing, and why he describes it as fairy palaces, is to show a contrast. And so you can see spending that bit of time thinking about those things helps, and helps you understand your understanding of the story and the technique itself. Now this is what we've got to do. You've got to do some thinking. And so what I've done there is looked at the subtext, and actually anybody can spot a technique. Like an iceberg, it's floating on the top of the surface. So everybody can do that. But no matter what level you are, anybody can spot a verb or a technique. That isn't a key skill. What the key skill is saying how this thing on the surface reflects something deeper. So the character's thoughts and feelings, the relationships that characters have, ideas, themes, symbolism. And so with this question, you've got to explain what the technique does in relation to the subtext, what's really going on under the surface. And so you've got to dig deep, and that takes thought and that takes time, and you can't rush. And this is where students fall down. They try to rush quick answers, and this question you need to take your time and do some thinking. Now to help you, we use Squeals. And so we're going to go back to Squeals and we're going to look at how that might look in your writing. So the first thing you do, and this is where I'm going to be very, very clear, your writing here doesn't need to be fancy. And as we show with Squeals, it's not fancy writing, it's all down to the explanation. So the first thing you do is you spot something. So the writer uses the metaphor, then you quote it. The writer uses the metaphor fairy palaces. Okay, the effect then is the next bit, to create a sense of amazement and beauty. All that's one sentence, and that gets you your 3 marks if it's appropriate and sounds effective. Then we start adding more into this, and this is where we're addressing the subtext, the explanation. The writer shows how Rosabelle feels her life isn't exciting or good enough. She wants a different life. The writer's description of the bust highlights the disgust and unpleasantness of her life. So you can see that in our explanation we're linking and we're developing, and we're not just throwing ideas out. We're kind of building up a big understanding of what's really going on here. And then we go to symbolize. This could symbolize how the poor have no chance of becoming rich. Rosabelle is on a bus going in the opposite journey to the wealthy in the city. And so we can see that we've built up, and all this bit here is about showing our understanding of what is really going on, the subtext. And so you don't have to use Squeals to write your paragraphs. You can put these in any particular order. We just find it useful to show students to plan using Squeals because it helps give you that idea. Because really, these are different skills. In a paragraph, we'd be expecting you to do all of these things in no particular order, but we'd be expecting those things, and we'd be looking for a response to see all of those things in there. Now, as a basic paragraph, that's a really reasonable effort. But actually, as we keep saying with this question, the more you explain, the better. And it's about your explanation of the why that is key. So we're going to look at how you can develop that explanation, and we're going to look at how you can build on the writing. So theirs is our Squeals paragraph, and you can straight away, it's got the basics there. Okay. Now, if we want to get the higher marks, we really need to push our explanation, and we really need to think about our explanation. So we're going to look at how ways in which you can develop those further. So we're using the same thing. So one thing you can do, really easy, and it really helps you develop explanations, is talk about the meaning of words. And what does the word have connotations? What does it remind us of? So for example, palace, rich, wealth, status. Fairy, imaginary, unrealistic. Okay, so then what that allows us to do is put some sentences in there to explain things in a little bit more detail. So we can say, why does the metaphor fairy palace create a sense of amazement? Well, because a palace has connotations of rich, wealth and status, and they're usually something impressive, aren't they? And so we can add those in there. So straight away we've got two sentences that we can add in there to develop our paragraph. And note, we're not adding more techniques in our explanation. We're actually building on an explanation rather than adding hundreds of things. And that's where some students fall down. They just think, right, well, let's just add another technique. Actually, what you need to do is add more depth to your explanation. And so by talking about what words mean, and there is nothing wrong in giving a definition of a word. In fact, actually, that's what grade 9 students do quite a lot. They define words and they give definition because that's helping them to explain what the writer is doing. The next thing we can do is we can add depth to what we're trying to say and the reasons. So here, Rosabelle is fed up in her job and she wants to escape it. The woman and the fairy palaces represent what she wants. And so here I'm adding more reasons to I've got this, and I'm expanding on a point. So she wants a different life. How do we know that she wants a different life? Well, actually in the rest of the story she's unhappy because she's in a job she doesn't like, selling hats, and so there's another woman that she's jealous of, and they represent what she wants to be. But also we can talk about the bus. The writer's description of the bus highlights the disgust and unpleasantness of her life, and so just as Rosabelle is trapped in her life, so too she is trapped on the bus. And so we're looking at a bit of symbolism, but we're giving more reasons why things are happening. So far we've added 4-5 sentences, adding to the explanation and going in a little more depth. To further extend our paragraph, what we can do is then link it to another technique. And so, for example, here we've got the writer uses the verb oozing to show the disgust the character has for a current situation of the people in her class. Oozing has connotations of disease. So, for example, you could think of a disease and something pussy oozing out pus, and something horrible and disgusting in it. It's really unpleasant, isn't it? So we can see that actually she sees the bus as a horrible experience, and this idea of oozing gives the fact that her life is maybe diseased and unpleasant. So we've linked the technique there. Next bit. The story uses contrast to highlight the difference in the class and society. Rosabelle has brown hair, whereas the other woman has more interesting red hair. And so we can add to that. So that's how you can see you can develop your paragraphs, adding extra layers of explanation. And there are 3 different things that we've done there. 1 is to explore the meanings of words. 2, we've given more detailed reasons why things happen. And this is that subtext element. And the other thing we can do is link it to other techniques in the story and the extract and build up that understanding there. All of that would make a very, very strong top band paragraph because you're using and showing a number of different skills. Does this student, with all these bits here, do they have a good understanding of the story, the subtext, and why the writer has used this particular technique? And the answer would be yes. So this shows you what you can do. And again, it's that planning. If you plan and think through things, then that helps you. And all this from one particular technique. So you've got to get used to this idea of saying a lot about very, very little. Now I'm going to give you some tips on how to address this question and what to think about. Now feel free to pause the video and jot these down so you've got them written down somewhere. So the key thing to remember is spotting techniques is only one part of the task. Explanation is key. If you are not explaining why the writer has used the technique, then you are not answering the question. And that's what the examiner will do. When they look at your response, they will be going, is this spotting or is this explaining? Is this spotting or is this explaining? When you move to explanation, then you are moving to 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 out of 8 marks for this question. If stuck and not sure, give a definition of a word. If you're not sure and don't know what to say, then give a definition and explain what that word means, because that will then help you to be able to link that to what you think the writer is trying to do. Think about why the writer wanted to create a particular feeling or mood. So like, for example, this extract here, we could view it as being magical, but also we could view it as kind of like unrealistic and almost like too good to be true. Why does the writer want us to feel that particular mood? Well, to understand how Rosabelle is unhappy and wants to escape her current life. Don't mention every language technique feature. Think about your choice of words when describing mood or effect or atmosphere. That's a really, really important thing to think about. Obviously, if you're struggling, think about whether it's a positive or negative mood that the writer is trying to create, and then you could add your understanding about particular moods. So you can say, is it a boring, miserable, depressing mood, or is it an excited, impressed, magical mood? And so using your choice of words really helps you to explain what the writer is trying to do. Key thing is thinking about what the writer is trying to get the reader to think, feel, or imagine. Use because, so, and as to help you explain things. Because, so, and as are really good explanation words, and you should be using those all the time because they force you to explain. And finally, 2 detailed paragraphs is enough to get full marks. It isn't about writing pages and pages. It's much better to have a detailed paragraph than lots of little tiny paragraphs. By having a detailed paragraph, you're explaining more. And remember what we said, explanation is key. If you've got small little paragraphs, then you're not explaining enough. And that's a big clue for us. If a student's explaining, a big detailed paragraph shows explanation. Small little paragraphs shows little explanation and often just spotting. Right, we're going to move on to some true and false statements now. Now what we'd like you to do is just pause the video and just decide which of these statements are true and which of these are false. So pause the video now, and when you've decided what's true and false, then unpause the video to see the answers. Okay, let's go through the answers then. So, number 1, terminology is more important than explanation in this question. Well, that is false. Okay, both are important, but your explanation gets you the higher marks. So you do need to mention terminology, but your explanation is the thing that's going to really get you your marks on this question. Number 2, you must use a quotation in your answer. That's true. You need to, as part of your Squeals, it is one of the things you need to do. Number 3, you need to aim for 4 paragraphs when responding to this question. That's false. 2 paragraphs is enough, but we want detailed paragraphs. Number 4, you must show a good understanding of the subtext for this question. That is true. You must show that you really know what's going on in the story, and that is down to your planning and your reading of the extract. Number 5, the examiner wants you to explore why a writer used a word or technique. That's true. It's key to this question and to understanding this question. Number 6, you shouldn't give a definition of the word. That's false. You should and you can, and there is no problem because it actually is part of the explanation. Giving a definition of a word that a writer's used is part of explaining what the writer has done. Number 7, you should use phrases like the reader wants to read on and the reader asks question in response. That's false. Okay, those are empty, meaningless phrases, and we really want you to avoid phrases like that. So we want you to say things like creates a sense of, or creates a particular mood, or creates an atmosphere, and describe what type of atmosphere. We want really precise phrases to do about the effect. And the reader wants to read on and the reader asks questions. That's what every story does. They're all designed to make the reader read on and make the reader ask questions. So there isn't much you can add by saying those things. Number 8, you can get full marks without mentioning a single piece of terminology. That is false. You must mention terminology. And terminology could be simple things like simile, repetition, contrast, imagery, verbs. Those are the things that we'd be expecting for terminology. And here are all the true answers. This video will stay on the YouTube channel and others are on there up until the final exam, so do use them as part of your revision for the different exams. Goodbye.